Good evening. This is Robert Maynard. I'm your host for this edition, the October edition of Operation City on Hill. Tonight's show is going to be called A Tale of Two Cities. It's a little bit of takeoff of Dickens' A Tale of Two Futures. And Tale of Two Cities is the Dickens classic, the title of which I got this story from. The title. Now, there's a famous line in Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. He is juxtaposing a case for optimism versus a case for pessimism. And that's what I want to look into tonight as we go into our show. Now, I'm going to take a look and review two different books that have pretty different views of the direction we're heading in. And the first one is what it's written by Harvard Psychologist Steven Pinker, and it's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it refers to what he sees as the cessation of the incident of violence as we've moved into the modern age. Now, those familiar with the 20th century, what is he talking about? Cessation of violence. We killed a lot of people in the 20th century. Well, what he's taking a long-term view. He said, if you look at the population, you look at the number of people being killed as a percentage of the population over a long period of time, even if you include the mass democide of the 20th century, the incidence of violence is going down, especially if you go all the way back to tribal times. The incidence of warfare. War has always been with us, as I'll go into later in another book by Donald Kagan. But basically, the incident of warfare as we enter into the modern age, even if you take into consideration the 20th century, has drastically been reduced when you compare it, if you go back in human history. So he's making the argument. The book is called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he is talking about a shift in human nature. Back in the tribal times, when you had people who were fighting over blood and soil all the time, that's what held you together. You had these tribes, tribal-based society, and they were fighting over blood and soil, and you had constant tribal warfare. And large percentages of populations were wiped out, and life was nasty and brutish and short, is the famous saying. So he's arguing, as we came into the modern age, and we had he's putting most of this on the Enlightenment, which we'll go into later. It may have been a little bit more of a mixed bag than an unmitigated good. But he's saying that the situation we face is there's an unwarranted pessimism because people, because of media and stuff like that, we see all these bad things going on, and we don't look back over historical period of time. And we have a great deal of pessimism, which he believes is unwarranted because he thinks we're living in the best times when looked at over a long swath of history. The question is if you look at a shorter period of time, let's say you go into from, relatively speaking, 19th century outside of the American Civil War was a time of peace and prosperity compared to the 20th century. If you go, so if you're looking at a shorter period of time, you have a huge spike in violence as we went into the 20th century and the rise of these totalitarian entities that murdered more people of their own people than were murdered and were killed in all the wars. And there's a site out by a sociologist. It's called Death by Government. And he talks about this incident, a democide you got, the biggest example was Mao's China. Then Stalin's Soviet Union was number two, and you had these incidents of these atrocious regimes who killed a lot of the people. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is this an historical aberration in a long swath of progress, as Pinkerton seems to insinuate? Or did we reach an inflection point in this progress, and are we at a point where we could start descending back into barbarism? as other people would tend to believe, including the brilliant philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who predicted a lot of the carnage of the 20th century when he wrote he wrote a lot of his work in the late 19th century. So the question we have to ask ourselves is the optimism that Pinkerton presents to us, is he justified? Is the 20th century an aberration over in what is the march of progress from tribal barbarism to a modern enlightened society? It's a good question. Another view, I think his name was Martin Gurri. I can't remember I think it was a former CIA analyst, and he wrote a book called The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority. And he's looking at, well, you had the rise of the Trump phenomena, you had the rise of the people like Bernie, you had the rise of populism, you had in the US, you see the Brexit exit in England, you see the Arab Spring in the Middle East, you see these spontaneous uprising of the masses in order to pull down formerly unassailable institutions. And he's arguing now that unlike I was listening to him on a TV show the other day, not TV show, it was a radio interview, long show. And he was being interviewed and he was being asked, well, what about, because he was talking, this is fairly unprecedented. And what about 1968? You had a lot of global revolution in 1968. And it was a lot about people then. He says, yeah, but that was a different type. These people were more organized, and it was based upon an ideology. It was a leftist ideology. It wasn't, he says, today's uprisings are, a lot of your uprisings around the globe is just populist anger against authority, anger against institutions. It's less ideologically driven than it is just, he doesn't quite put it this way, but it's a temper tantrum. So people have lost faith in the institution, thus the subtitle is The Crisis of Authority. So I want to ask yourself, is this indicative of a crisis in modernity itself? Is there certain aspects of modernity that may lead to this? And we talked earlier in the show when I talked about the right going off track, and I talked about people like some of the alternative right figures, and Stephen Bannon that were supporting Trump, and Bannon became an advisor to Trump. And we looked into their ideological background and ideological motivations, religious, ideological, and otherwise. And it turns out many of these people are of the opinion that modernity, enlightenment, was a disaster for modern civilization. It left us without a soul. And they're not alone in this view. You've got jihadis. This is one of their biggest problems, is that modern civilization is technocratic and is soulless. And so there's, to one degree or another, this has been an argument that has been you could say a lot of traditionalist types are struggling with the changes of modernity, and a lot of the changes undermine traditions, but there's for some of them who are saying, there's some of them who say, no, that it's more than just a pace of change. There's something there's a fundamental shift at the level of first principles that people find problematic. And I have always had a little bit of hesitation to give credence to these broad statements either for or against the Enlightenment, because you had more than one Enlightenment. You had the Scottish Enlightenment, you had the American Enlightenment, you had the British Enlightenment, you had the French Enlightenment, so when you said the Enlightenment, there was no the Enlightenment, there was many. And so, in the Enlightenment, it was a mixed bag. He had his good parts and he had parts that were not so good. And I want to go into Well, the scientific development and the attempted break with authoritarianism, although it brought some would say it brought a new authoritarianism with it. The attempted break with authoritarianism had some good things that came with it: religious freedom, the liberty of individual conscience was not exclusive purview of enlightenment, but it did tend to push in that, some aspects of it did tend to push in that direction. But I want to, and particularly in the discussion on war and peace, I want to talk about a book by Professor Donald Kagan, who was a classical scholar, and he wrote a book called The Origins of War and the Preservation of Peace. And he starts talking about war has always been with us. And in this sense, he's very similar to Pinkerton in saying the war has been a constant in human history. And the very idea that we should even pursue peace was unknown to the ancients. It would have been unintelligible. That the war was like a spring storm, as natural as a spring storm. It brought about new things like a spring storm did, and it was, strife is natural, and it's the way you progress. You want something, you go to war and you take. Well, nowadays we trade. And so, you have economic trade rather than wars of plunder. And Pinkerton makes the argument, now he doesn't talk about the economic aspect. That's a lot of your free market economists of the 19th century of what is referred to as classical liberalism. Well, one of the reasons why they believed in free trade was today your people on your left and right both will say, well, free trade is only supported by these global elite who want to disenfranchise workers. But no, they wanted free trade because historically violence has been the way people get ahead, and free trade was considered a natural right of people to exchange goods instead of going to war for them. So it was a form of peaceful cooperation, as opposed to Adam Smith was one of the most brilliant exponents of free trade. Was not he's known as an economist, but he was a moral philosopher. His economic theory was applying his moral philosophy to economic activity. He was a moral philosopher, and his whole idea of the free hand, the invisible hand that was guiding human affairs, was based upon his understanding of the moral dimension of human beings and their natural tendency towards benevolence. So, but that aspect wasn't, the economic argument wasn't picked up by Kagan. Kagan was making something that I think is connected, but he doesn't make it in his book. He was saying that the Judeo-Christian tradition in general, and the Sermon on the Mount in particular, is what changed this idea from the classical understanding of the Greeks and the Romans. War is the health of the state. Actually, as something that is inducive for change. It's inducive for progress. You need war and strife. It's a natural part of. It's nature. But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, they made the argument that human beings are not just part of nature, that we have a certain dignity and a certain responsibility to rise above nature. So Kagan is arguing that for the first time you had these nations that were at the forefront of civilization. There were, instead of Rome and Greece and these ancient pagan nations where might makes right, or as Aristotle put it, justice, no. Some are born to rule and some are born to be ruled, Aristotle said. And Thrasymachus and some of the sophists before him, justice is the advantage of the stronger. And that was the ancient view of justice. Justice is the advantage of the stronger. And Aristotle would make the argument that some men are born to rule and some men are born to be ruled. And Augustine once pointed out and saying that human beings were not meant to rule other human beings. Human beings were meant to have a dominion over creation as a steward, but not to rule over each other, because we're rational beings, and rational beings are meant for self-rule. So this is an argument that, according to Kagan, gave rise to the idea that we should pursue peace, and that war wasn't a natural part of human behavior. It was possibly resulted to our falling away from the corruption of our nature, falling away from it. So that's what Kagan is arguing. Now, so he's saying that as you start to achieve this ideal, you're having these advances in civilization, eventually people started to think that they could pursue peace through social engineering. And for the first time in human history, as Enlightenment came about, you had this idea. Because of technical progress, you were able to engineer technical marvels. Well, why couldn't you engineer social marvels? And the idea that you could bring about peace, prosperity, and all these ideals that came about as a result of the Judeo-Christian understanding of human nature was seen as something that technocrats could socially engineer. And you could eliminate war, you could eliminate hunger, you could eliminate disease. And this idea of putting the best and brightest in power and giving them the access to resources so that they could shape society, because human beings were malleable. You shape the economic and social forces driving life, and you could shape human beings and get rid of the selfishness, and just they become cogs in a big machine. Fascism was driven by these ideas. Communism, socialism, Nazism. There was a lot of people, when they first started out, they really believed they're going to create an utopia. They're going to socially engineer a society in much the same way an engineer engineers an experiment. And they're going to create these, when you create these experiments, you create advances in technology to make our life better. So they're going to create advances in human civilization, a socially engineered civilization. Now, along with the advances in focuses on human rights, the Enlightenment came about. Out of some forms of Enlightenment. This idea of social engineering was something that the part of the American Enlightenment was against the 20th century. Post-World War American conservatism was trying to preserve classical liberalism, rejected this aspect of it. But that's another story. So we're making the argument that as we come into modernity, you're going to have an elite who is going to be able to socially engineer society, and you're going to get rid of war. You're going to get rid of famine. You're going to get rid of all these problems. You put the best and brightest in charge, and they're going to manipulate the social and economic conditions that human beings live under and solve all your problems. Well, there's a problem with that, in that is human life, human behavior, comparable to the material substances that are the subject of engineering experiments? In order to apply the scientific method to engineer human society, you have to assume that they are. Or if B.F. Skinner, the behavioral psychologist, once said, in order to apply the disciplines of the scientific method to human behavior, you have to assume that human beings are not free, and that's what they did. And so you got the masses are subjects of a social experiment, and you got these experts experimenting them on, and some people, like you had. I'm trying to think of his name. Ludwig von Mises, an Austrian economist, but he was more kind of a philosopher. He applied philosophy to economics. And he was arguing that human society is too complicated to socially engineer. There's no way to calculate. The interactions between human beings are just too complicated. It's not something you can engineer. And some people would say, well, that's an assumption. The hard science is something that you can apply to human science. Can you socially engineer human behavior the way you can? And some would say, well, at certain levels, even in the physical sciences, you have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. At certain levels of quantum experience, things don't line up the way they do in Newtonian physics. You can't even measure with an uncertainty. And Kurt Gödel was, in mathematics, he has the incompleteness theorem that the discipline of mathematics is not complete, so you can't, there are things we know to be true that cannot be arrived at through the traditional mathematical approach. I'm not going to go into it. It's fairly complex. It's called Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So this brought question to the old Newtonian physics notion of everything is predictable, manageable, and that, if that's true, even of physical substances at a certain level, those of us who argue that humans' knowledge and human consciousness and human decision making is of a different orientation than physical interaction and matter, would argue that the idea that you can socially engineer human existence the way you would a scientific experiment is laughable. The idea, I mean, it's not laughable because it's tragic that when you look at what has happened because of us taking this idea upon ourselves, you're going to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. And some of these people who, the Pol Pots and the Stalins and the Maos, they honestly believed they were going to create a utopia. So killing a few people here and there, more than a few, but is small price to pay to create an utopia. And the problem is that their views of human nature was based upon a deterministic Newtonian science view of human sciences. And then as time went on, it became pretty clear that this experiment was not working. And I would make my argument that this revolt of the public is an unconscious recognition that a society that's ruled by experts that's going to socially engineer human existence doesn't work. And so there's a revolt against the crisis of authority is because the authority, I believe the authority is claiming too much. This is my interpretation. You aren't going to find this in this explanation in this book. He sees this as a crisis that we need to solve, and we need a new set of elites who are going to be able to come and solve the problems because people have lost faith in our institutions. And I have talked previously about our institutions. And the institutions we have put a lot of trust in these large institutions to take care of us. And in the industrial age, and as we move into the information age, that the industrial order is breaking down. And this revolt of the public and the crisis of authority, I think, is a symptom of that. It's breaking down, and people unconsciously realize that. Nietzsche, I'm going to Friedrich Nietzsche because I mentioned I was talking to him. He predicted back in the 19th century that he referred to what is referred to as the death of God. We replace God with a social engineer. So we don't need God. We socially engineer our own society who needs this transcendent authority standing above us. So he basically declared that there is this phenomena called the death of God, that we killed God. He's an atheist, so he's in other words, the belief in God was killed. So, but what his argument was that this was no small thing. With the death of God, the distinction between human beings and animals is erased. You don't have this distinction between human beings and animals anymore. So you have the possibility, the likelihood of wars like you've never seen before, because you're back into the survival of the fittest, where you're going to have people rise up against people and nation against nation. It's almost biblical in his predictions. And you're going to have the rise of the Superman, the Übermensch. And this Superman is going to impose these new set of values on people. And that's what people like Hitler and Stalin were familiar with this thinking. That's what they're trying to do. They're going to create this new civilization. And they're going to, led by the Übermensch, the Superman. Now, as we move into the modern age, we come out of World War II, and we have had relatively a peaceful coexistence for a while, but some experts were saying this is because of the economic situation is being enforced by the U.S. The U.S. is enforcing a global trade order, where nations like China and Japan were able to rise up fairly peacefully through economics. The question is, if it's probably not going to continue. And it's not the same thing as the free trade of the 19th century that people took on voluntarily. It has to be imposed by U.S. military, and U.S. getting sick of being the policeman of the world. So you're going to have possibility of these conflicts over resources again as U.S. This book is called The Absent Superpower. The U.S. stops being the policeman of the world, pulls back, and other nations start to go into collapse into a fight over energy. Now, and there's other scenarios. I haven't got time to go into. Maybe I'll do another show on this sometime. But these other scenarios talk about the rise of warfare over resources, warfare over blood and soil, all kinds of the kind of warfare that we've seen with the tribal age returning. And I would argue that if this happens, it's because we haven't got past the conditions that Nietzsche saw as the reason why we had these problems in the 20th century. The rise of Superman, the death of God, and the elimination of the distinction between man and animals. Now, the question rises as to whether or not the retreat of America as the world policeman would result in this kind of open warfare. Maybe, maybe not. That's still open to question. Does peace have to be enforced with a global military, or can you have a sense of shared values? And that's the question. We have information technology that allows the world to come together, and as the CIA analyst was making his comment, a lot of these revolutions are brought together but the only thing that's holding them together is anger. Right now there's a nihilism that's people are united by nihilism, and they can organize spontaneously like they never could before because of social media. Social media is what's holding people together organizationally. It's replacing these institutions, but what's driving that is anger. If we could use the social media phenomena to replace the institutions that people have got lost hope in, and they're falling apart anyway, and they're centralized because I think they've become obsolete. But you could drive this global interaction with shared values, universal values, then you have hope for possibility, the kind of peace and prosperity of a global society we haven't seen before. So this is where I get the title of my talk tonight, A Tale of Two Futures. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. There is a possibility of going into global anarchy and chaos and returning to tribalism on a huge scale, with weapons we've never seen before in history. Or there's a possibility us coming together on a scale and creating a global civilization that is not a global government, but is from the bottom up, the people do themselves, brought together by shared values. Which way we go is anybody's guess. Well, not anybody's guess. A lot of that is up to us. Do we come together with shared values, or are we just united by anger? Can hope overcome anger? In despair? And that's the question. And we're not going to have some elite or some leader or some political figure answer this for us. We can only answer it ourselves. This has been Operation City on a Hill for October edition. Next week or next month we'll be back with another. I haven't figured out what the topic is going to be, but as soon as I'm got some ideas, but we'll be back next month with another edition. This is Robert Maynard signing off. Good night and good luck.